Okay, so let's look at number one here, which is about word choice. We're wondering which of these four words works best. And these questions, there's not too much to talk about. The first question would be, did you know all four words? And I believe in this case you probably do know what each of these words means. In which case, the question becomes more about context. That is, which one just works best here? And maybe the most methodical way of thinking about this is to cross this word off, and just try it with your own word in there, without any of these four words. So maybe give ourselves a little bit of context. The sentence above says that Greek yogurt businesses have found many methods of controlling and eliminating most environmental threats. Given these solutions, as well as the many health benefits of the food, the advantages blank the potential drawbacks of its production. So they sort of cancel out or make it worthwhile for them to make this food. And it doesn't have to be something eloquent, like you just heard me sort of stumble over that phrase, but it was useful. It doesn't defeat or outdo or outperform, it outweighs, because we're sort of looking for a balance here. Right? We're the pros and cons. So, I mean, this is a sort of maybe a question that you might refer to as idiomatic, which is a fancy way of saying based on style. And so there's not much more to say about this because it's simply about the style in which we speak within the culture. These ones are less important than some of the other ones we're going to look at today. But let me know if you have any further questions about this one. Okay, so here's our next one, which is number 9. And we're wondering which of these four phrases sort of connect these two sentences. That is, these phrases also, in other words, therefore and for instance, they all serve the purpose of explaining how the next sentence, the sentence that contains these words, relates to the previous sentence. Right? Is it adding on to it, which is also? Is it explaining it just using different language? Is there a connection where we can say the next logical piece is whatever this sentence is talking about? Therefore is like a causal relationship, suggesting that after we know the previous sentence, we can say something further in this next sentence, or for instance, which suggests it's an example. There's some similarities here, but also some important differences. And it's important to think about these questions in a critical way. It's also important to just straight up cross off this word when you're trying to figure out what goes in here, because your brain will try to make sense of whatever connecting word is put in here. If I put for example in there, my brain's going to expect an example to follow, and will try to sort of make an example out of something even if it isn't a good example. So we can't be swayed by this initial word. We must cross it off and read above and think about in our own words what the connection is between the information above and below. It's also important that make sure you give yourself enough context here. I'm going to read maybe starting with nutritionists. So they consider it to be healthy. It's an excellent source of protein and calcium. Serves as a digestive aid. Contains few calories. It's slightly lower in sugar and carbohydrates than conventional yogurt is. Because it is more concentrated, contains slightly more protein per serving, thereby helping people say something. Probably slim or healthy or something like that. Either way. Seems like this happens like in a list of positives. Right? It's a source of these good things. It's a digestive aid. Doesn't have a lot of calories. It's slightly lower in sugar and carbs. Let me think carefully about that last phrase. Slightly lower in sugar and carbs. I don't think the next sentence is saying this in other words. That is, I think it's slightly different if even if it's related, it's different to say that it's lower in sugar and carbs. That's a different phrase than saying that it's got more protein. So I'm crossing out in other words. It also doesn't seem like a logical inference. I can't say that like because it has less sugar and carbs, it has more protein. It doesn't seem to make sense. It also doesn't seem like it's an example. So it must be the original also. An additional fact among all of these other facts. More importantly, you can see that instead of falling in love with answer choice A, I really just thought critically about why these other ones were wrong from a functional standpoint. What is the function of these three words? Thinking about how they might be incorrect in that functionality. So please let me know by all means if you have any other questions about number 9. But the most important thing to notice here is that I crossed this word off in question, and I thought critically about what these connecting words actually do functionally in the sentence. I sort of laid that out before I got to work on the question, so I knew what my options were. Sort of a word that says additionally, something that says I'm going to clarify by saying it in different language, a logical connector with therefore, and then an example connector with D. Okay, let's keep going here. Okay, so our next one is number 15. And it's important with these sort of answer choices, unlike the ones we've looked at before, like number 14. And, we should say that number 14 was a lot like number 9. That is, connecting words that connect logical phrases. But unlike those questions, number 15, we have a bunch of language in the answer choices. And before we get to work, we kind of want to identify what the differences are. And it looks like the differences are where do we have these commas, right? Commas in different places. These are the kind of questions that most students rely purely on sound, and that's problematic. It's important to really think carefully about what these commas are doing. Okay, so it seems like these commas are trying to separate extra information, like, is the subject Jason Box? Do we need to include this information about his professorship, or can we just say his name? That is, like, can we separate that information? Should we, or is it necessary for the meaning of the sentence? If it's necessary for the meaning of the sentence, we're not going to use commas. If we can get away with saying that that information is extra and could be crossed off and the sentence still makes sense, then we're going to put it in commas. So let me show you what I mean by that. Let me also just say that 9 times out of 10, the answer with the least punctuation is right. Maybe more generally and a little bit more functionally, just less is more, generally speaking. Okay, so the original one has 1 comma. Now, the problem with using 1 comma, only 1, and I guess the other thing we should mention is that this semicolon gives me a clear demarcation. That is, I don't have to worry about anything after the semicolon because the semicolon says this is the end of a full sentence. And the SAT never makes you consider the answer to number 16 as you're doing number 15. You never have to work backwards and say, well, what's going on here? I don't know. I better think about that before I do number 15. That would be an unfair question. So we can just say that this is a clear line of demarcation where we don't have to worry about anything after this. This is the end of an independent clause, a full sentence. And actually, we are going to end up changing this because of what happens after. But the point is that for number 15, we should not have to worry about number 16. So, semicolon's the end of the sentence that we have to worry about for now. And my point about this comma was that if we have only 1 comma in this independent clause, then it must be true that really one side is the independent clause and the other stuff is extra. That is, you never have like a subject, comma, verb. That just does not work. You can have like extra stuff and then the full sentence, which contains, the independent clause contains both subject and verb by necessity. Because in order to be an independent clause, it must have an agent doing something and something that that agent does. Subject plus verb. So I can kind of cross answer choice A off because Jason Box seems to be the subject here who believes, right? I mean, I guess you could make a case that like an associate professor of geology at Ohio State believes that another factor added to the early thaw. But while that is an independent clause, it seems pretty clear to most of us that Jason Box is the person we're talking about. And we usually don't consider this the normal construction of independent clause. So maybe I'll soft cross off A. That is, I don't love it, but you could make a technical argument for the subject not being this person's name, but his title. Now, B is more clearly wrong for the same reason, which is that regardless of if the subject is the name Jason Box or his professorship, we should not have a comma between the subject stuff, which is that first stuff, and then believes, which would be the next word that comes after Ohio State in answer choice B. That's just never going to happen. That's this mistake. Subject, comma, verb. So I'll hard cross that one off. Now, answer choice C. It says, but Jason Box, comma, an associate professor of geology at Ohio State. Here we have a second comma, and the way these two commas are working is as a parenthetical phrase, which gets to the heart of what we're talking about. Can we cross off this extra information in between those two commas and have the rest of the sentence make sense? But Jason Box believes that another factor added to the thought. That works. And so that's probably the right answer. We'll talk about this last one before we sort of decide between A and C. We have a couple of commas here. So again, we can cross off this phrase in the middle. And this is, I guess, a little bit less intuitive question because certainly maybe the same way that A looked technically okay, D looks technically okay, but it's because it says, but Jason Box at Ohio State believes that another factor added to the early thaw, the dark snow problem. Yeah, so that seems at some level okay, but this preposition at Ohio State, while it may be sort of indirectly referring to Jason Box, it's more directly clarifying where this person is a professor of geology, an assistant professor of geology at Ohio State. So because this preposition, and prepositions include words like to, on, of, for, by, at, of course, as we see, and some others. Because this preposition more directly refers to geology, it doesn't make sense to sort of divorce it from this phrase, an associate professor of geology. So even though the best answer contains two commas, what the best answer does do is use grammar more sparingly in the sense that it does not break up phrases that should not be broken up. Right? So C is the best answer because the simplest version of the subject is Jason Box. The information about his professorship describes him and is therefore extra information. And answer choice D incorrectly breaks that description up in the middle. So not the easiest question in this style. I could say that if you pick A or D, that you're somewhat close, and I would invite you to maybe ask some more specific questions about this. It looks like you picked B on your original, and so I think that there's a more clear reason why that's wrong. To be clear, that's the mistake of subject separated from verb. Okay, so the next one here is number 19. This one is about pronouns, and we can see that by the answer choices. They're all, pronouns here. Especially these two seem particularly important. I guess that's because answer choice A is really it is, which could be related to like they are, or there as a contraction. But that's not what we have for answer choice C. And what I mean to say is because B and D both imply possession, something that it owns or something that they own. Those have the same function, whereas A and C only relate to these others in the sense that they look like them. This one talks about place, not they are. So I mean to say, if we had answer choice A as it is and had changed C to they are, I might be more inclined to think that one of those two is right because they'd be the same function. It is, one thing is, or many things are. In this case, it's not saying that, so because these two seem to be sort of loners, I'm more than likely going to cross them off. I should probably just not cross them off yet and not be that cocky, but I'm fairly certain it's one of these two that have the same function, which is possession. Right, so we're wondering if it is possessive, whose ability to reflect the sun's rays, limiting whose ability. And so what is it that's reflecting the sun's rays? So let me look back here. Okay, there's soot particles. Do those reflect the sun's rays? Darkening snow and ice, which limits the ability of, I think, not the soot particles, but the snow and ice. And actually, it doesn't matter either way. Particles is plural, snow and ice is two things. I'm fairly certain it's the snow and ice, but either way, both of those are plural, and therefore we have to go with the plural answer. So this is a classic one, and we're going to ask anytime we see something to do with pronouns. Also, oftentimes we have verb tense in the picture. Who or what are we referring to? Be very detailed in that. Who or what is limited in its ability to reflect the sun's rays? Open yourself up to the possibility of any noun in the previous clause or sentence being what we're referring to. Think carefully about which one it is. In this case, it didn't really matter. I didn't have to worry about the distinction between those two very different ideas, soot particles versus snow and ice, because both of those sets were plural, and therefore I'm going to use a plural pronoun there for either of them.